So in today's lesson, we're going to be talking about what everyone gets wrong about modes. And of course, I know some of you probably know this already, so don't bother leaving a comment saying, "Oh, I knew this already." Okay, but most people get this wrong about modes. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Okay, so on the left here, we have all of the modes of the major scale listed, and I'm listed them out in C, the modes of the C major scale. Of course, you can apply this stuff to other keys. That's kind of your responsibility to know the notes that are in other keys so you can apply it to other keys. And most of you, if you've learned anything about modes, you probably know everything that's on there, okay? So you have the first mode of the major scale is literally just if you play the major scale straight up, you start it from the first note. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then C, you can double up the root, etc., etc. And then the way that we get the modes, or the way that most people think of the modes, is by saying, okay, well, what happens if we take the C major scale or any major scale and start it from a different note other than the first note of the scale? And then what we do is we actually compare what we get by starting it from a different note of the major scale. We actually compare it to the parallel major. So for example, that might have confused you, but check out the Dorian mode. So the Dorian mode, D Dorian in this case, is what happens when we think of the major scale, the C major scale, starting from a D note, right? So D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and then D. So most people think that modes are just this. They're basically just a scale, right? It's, I'm taking the C major scale and I'm starting it from a certain note and ending on a certain note. I'm starting on a different note. Same thing with Phrygian. If I start it from the E, the third note, that's the Phrygian mode. And while this is kind of true to an extent, there is more to the story, and this is the part that people get wrong when they think about modes. They think of them purely as a scale. So first of all, there's a couple of problems with this, okay? The first problem is that, well, what happens if I am playing a solo and I don't start on that note, right? How is it called Phrygian if I'm just thinking of it as a scale that starts on, for example, E? How is it called Phrygian? Well, if I, mix the notes up. So instead of doing this, I go, Now all of a sudden, is that really Phrygian anymore? Is it just a mode when I literally play it like that, a scale upwards and downwards? And if that's the case, well, that's not super useful, because in real music, we don't really just play scales up and down, right? I mean, you could do that. Usually most people are not happy with their playing when they're doing that. They're like, I sound too much like I'm playing scales. So again, this is not to get super in depth into all of the modes. If you don't know anything about modes, go watch my other video. I have a whole playlist, actually, a link above, that is explaining each of the modes sort of from the bare bones point of view. Okay, so this is assuming that you already are somewhat familiar with the modes and the stuff that's on the left here. So what everybody gets wrong is they don't understand that modes are not really a scale. They're actually chords. It's almost like we're thinking of all the notes in the scale and thinking of them as one big giant chord that has 7 notes in it. So now I'm going to go to the next page here. And this is now how to think of the modes as chords, not scales. So actually now we have all of the exact same modes. It's all the same information that we were just looking at, except now the notes are arranged and spelled out in a different order, so that we're basically stacking them up like one big, giant chord here. Okay, so for example, if we look at the first mode, Ionian, again, that's the fancy schmancy mode name for it. It's really just the major scale, starting from the root. But If now, instead of thinking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, now we think of it as one big giant chord that's stacked in thirds. So if you notice, we have C, E, G, B, and then D, F, and A. So we think of this as like one big giant chord, and I actually am going to play it on a piano here for a second. So we think of it as one big giant chord, which is like C, E, G, B, D, F, A. That is really the sound of the Ionian mode. And of course, it sounds really kind of complex, and it should sound complex. It's a freaking chord that has 7 different notes in it, okay? Now, of course, that's literally just stacking them up in thirds. If you're a really good piano player, piano players will kind of do this stuff a lot where they'll rearrange those notes in different octaves. You know, they might play C and G, and they might play the A next to that, and they might play the B. They might play it all as a giant cluster, basically. You can almost just do this. And like somebody, if they didn't know any better, they think, oh, wow, that's some amazing chord. Really, it's just playing all the white keys all right next to each other on the piano. But this is the real way that we want to think of modes. We want to think of them as chords. And the reason is because the only way that we're going to get the sound of a particular mode is the same thing of how chords work. The most important note in a chord is the root note, or the bass note, actually, particularly the lowest note in the chord. So for example, now, if we play, I'm going to put on a backing track that's got a C chord going in the background. Well, what's happening here? The piano is playing a C major chord, and there's a C in the bass. So now, if I play any of these notes, I want to familiarize myself with what are the chord tones. The root, third, fifth, and the seventh depends on what style you're thinking of. If the seventh's going to be a chord tone. And then the color tones, or you could also think of it as the non-chord tones. So if I play over this chord, C is the root, and then E is the third, G is the fifth, B is the seventh. And then now I'm getting into D, F, and A. Those are going to be my kind of more colorful, sophisticated sounding notes over this chord. So D would be the ninth now. By the way, we're thinking of it as ninth, 11th, and 13th, not 2, 4, and 6, because we're thinking of this idea of stacking it like a giant chord, right? So this would be D. And then this would be F, the 11th. That's actually a very, very tense sounding note over that chord, right? And then A, the 13th. So as you can hear, this is really the way to actually understand each of the different modes. Now, another thing I've seen people bring up is like, well, what if I play, let's say I play one of the modes of the major scale, let's say Phrygian. I was talking about that one before, you know, so starting the scale on an E note, the third note of the major scale, guess what? I can think of that all I want to, but if there's a C major chord in the background, it ain't gonna sound like Phrygian, okay? Because when I play that E note, it's going to sound like the third of the C major chord. So let's stay in the C major chord. And now I'm going to play the Phrygian scale, the E Phrygian scale over it. It doesn't really sound like Phrygian. Phrygian is supposed to be a minor chord. Phrygian is a very dark, tense sounding mode. It still sounds very happy and bright. Why? Because there's a freaking C major chord in the background. It doesn't matter what like order I'm thinking of the scale playing it in, because each of the notes has to relate to the chord underneath. That's the most important thing that you need to understand, is the way the notes sound depends on how they relate to the bass note and ultimately the chord that's being played in the background. By the way, even if I just let's remove this piano for a second. Now I just have C in the background, just a C bass note, and it's still gonna sound like, oh look, I'm playing E. I just played an E Phrygian scale over the C bass note. It ain't sound like Phrygian. It doesn't sound dark and gloomy or anything like that. It sounds nice. It sounds like, like majory. Because that sounds like the major third. Because it is. Because the intervallic relationship between the E and the C underneath is that the E is going to be the major third. So let's really beat this topic into the dirt here, because now we're going to go through each of the other modes and see how it sounds. Okay, so now we have a D in the bass and we have a D minor chord in the background. So now, of course, I get D, F, A, and C as my chord tones, like a seventh chord. So D, F, A, C. So each of those notes has a character to it when it's related to that D underneath. Now we're gonna go to the 9th, 11th, and 13th. So E is the 9th. Ooh, that's a very nice sounding note. It doesn't sound like a chord tone, but it sounds very cool and sophisticated. What about the 11th, G? And then B, the 13th. This 13th over that minor chord sounds also very sort of colorful and sophisticated, if not a little bit tense. So again, let's try that test. Let's say I'm gonna play the C major scale now over the D minor chord. I'm gonna start on C. Let's try it. I'm gonna start on C. I'm just gonna literally play a stock C major scale. Now you can kind of hear that it's a major scale because it's such a strong sound, but when I play that C, it sounds like the flat 7 of the chord. It doesn't sound like the root of a C major scale. It sounds like the flat 7. Now this sounds like the root of the chord because it is. This is D, and then E, there's your 9th, and then the flat 3. So now let's move on to E minor, okay? The E Phrygian mode, okay? So same thing. All of those different notes are gonna sound different over the chord because of the chord and the bass note is different underneath. They're all the same notes, but they sound kind of different because they relate differently. So let's try let's play a C major scale over this. Like that C sounds very tense over that chord. Why? Because that C is not actually one of those main chord tones in that Phrygian mode. That Phrygian mode, the main chord tones are E, G, B, and D. So those are going to be the more stable sounding notes over it. So if you see, I very deliberately separated the main chord tones from the color tones. And color tones, they can sound really nice, but sometimes they can sound a little bit more tense. And this is why you're taking a little bit more of a risk when you play those color tones. Now, of course, the way that you get really good at this is actually practicing exactly like this and saying, hey, let me play over a chord and let me really, really sink my teeth into how each of those chord tones sound. So like, if I'm practicing Phrygian, playing over, by the way, this would be like the 3 chord. If I'm playing over a chord progression that's passing by and I'm on the 3 chord, this is basically the vibe that's gonna be happening is Phrygian. So I'll be like, okay, what does E sound like? Cool, that's the root. It sounds like a root. It sounds perfect. The flat 3. It sounds like a flat 3. The 5th, it sounds like a 5th. And then the D is the flat 7. So each of those, it's funny because that E, G, B, and D have basically the same type of feel if you go up and look at the Dorian mode as the D, F, A, and C had over the D minor chord. So it's a lot more important how the notes relate to the chord underneath. So let's go check out F Lydian. So here's F Lydian. And I'm just going to continue playing the same thing. C major scale over it. And then now this would be thinking of it like a giant chord. So here's F the root, and then A is the third, and C is the fifth, and then E is the major 7, and then G is the 9th, B is the sharp 11, and then D is the 13th. Sometimes, by the way, that's really good to practice, is playing that big giant arpeggio like this. Okay, cool. Let's move on to G Mixolydian. I don't want to take too much longer because it's already been going a while. So let's go to G Mixolydian. So here's what the C major scale would sound like over it. So that C, it's funny, that's the root of the scale. That C sounds tense though over that Mixolydian mode because it's the 11th. If you look there, C is the 11th on the chart with the Mixolydian. So now I gotta think of G, B, D, and F are more my main chord tones that I wanna focus on when I'm playing it. So G is the root, and then B is the third, and D is the fifth, and then F is the flat 7, and then A is the 9th, C is the 11th, and then E is the 13th. So whenever I'm playing on the 5 chord on a song, that's what I'm kind of thinking about is, oh, okay, I got to reorient myself. So again, this is why we always have to reorient sort of where the gravity of the notes is going to, depending on what chord we're playing on. So we got 2 more left. We got the 6th chord, which is the Aeolian mode. So this is like A minor, of course. So A is the root, and C is the flat 3, E is the 5th. Again, those feel like home base because they are, because of 1, flat 3, and 5. And then G is the flat 7. Again, it has the same feel as the flat 7 on the Dorian or the Phrygian mode, right? Those are all kind of constant with any of those modes that are based on a minor chord. But then we have A, we have a regular 9th, or sorry, B is the 9th, and then D is the 11th. And then this one is very crunchy, the flat 13, F. Ooh, flat 13's on a minor chord. Oh, well, we just learned something. Flat 13 on a minor chord, that's a very crunchy sounding note. So if I'm soloing, by the way, I will resolve that down to E very quickly. I'll go like, so I can play it, but I don't really want to sit on it until I resolve it, right? So it sounds very, very tense and crunchy. And then finally, we can go to the 7th mode. This is a very, very, this is the darkest sounding mode, actually, because it's based on a diminished chord, the Locrian mode. So now we have root, flat 3, flat 5, and flat 7. So there's the root, B, and then the flat 3 is D, and then flat 5. And then A is the flat 7. And then we keep going. C is the flat 9. Ooh, that flat 9. Flat 9, it always sounds very tense. Flat 9's a tense sounding note. Also, if you notice, the Phrygian mode has a flat 9 in it. What about now E? Ooh, that actually doesn't sound bad. That 11th sounds cool on both minor and diminished chords. It doesn't sound so hot on major chords because it clashes with the 3rd. It's only a half step away. And then G, the flat 13. Let's see how that one sounds. That actually sounds very interesting. It doesn't sound bad at all. And one of the reasons for that is because, well, it's not going to technically clash with anything because the flat 5 is F, that's a whole step away. And then the flat 7 is A, that's also a whole step away. So usually we get these clashes on each chord because they're playing notes that are a half step away from one of those main chord tones, particularly a note that's a half step above one of those main chord tones. So if we go back to like C, this is a really important concept for you guys. C, if I play an F, which is the 11th, it sounds very crunchy and clashy. And it wants to go down to E. Same thing if I go to, let's say, the G chord. Now I play C, which is the 11th. It doesn't sound super stable. It wants to be like there on the 3rd, right? So again, you're never gonna have a true understanding of the modes until you really understand them as chords. So if you want to learn how to master the guitar fretboard so that you can understand how to play in any key over any chord over every single place in the entire guitar fretboard, make sure you head on over to Jamsville.com right now and check out the Jamsville GPS Fretboard Fundamentals course. This has one of the biggest values of any course on the entire planet, and I made it specifically so that it teaches you everything that I wish I would have known from the beginning when I was first learning about the guitar and learning how to play solos and learning how to understand the fretboard so that you can get to the place that you want to be way faster than I did. So make sure you head on over and check out the course right now on Jamsville.com. Also, if you're interested in my favorite guitar picks, check out the link in the description below for the Dan's Guitar Store Precision Pick. This is hands down my favorite pick because it has the best grip of any pick that I've ever used. And on top of that, it has the best picking edge. It has this really cool beveled edge on it that I've never seen in any other pick that literally cuts through the strings like a hot knife through butter. Also, by the way, I just dropped a new song. So if you're interested in some of the music that I make sure you check out the link in the description below to my Spotify page and check out my new song. It's called My Divine. Also, last thing, if you want some awesome freaking Jamsville merch, like this awesome Jamsville t-shirt, which looks so cool, I was wearing it all over the place the last several days, make sure you check out the link in the description for the Jamsville merch store. We got t-shirts, we got sweaters, we got coffee mugs, anything you can want with the awesome Jamsville logo on it so you can represent that you're a guitar player and that you know what you're doing on the guitar, because if you watch the Jamsville channel, chances are you're pretty good and you know what you're doing. All right, everybody, until next time, listen, learn, and jam.